the attendees numbers going up. So if people are walking in, welcome. We're at 60 and it is climbing. So I'm just going to say hello. My name is Gary Cranston. I'm the president here at the American Writers Museum. To all the members who know me, hello. For those of you who are starting to join us and have been here before, you may recognize where I'm sitting. This is where we normally have our programs. I am not working out of my home today. It is a special occasion. It's called the day of the week that I come in to pay the bills. So all of our staff are working from home. As you've seen, our director of programming, Allison, has done a number of these programs recently. So we're looking forward to our program tonight. I'm gonna just give it another minute as the number keeps going up. And I wanna make sure that people are in before we get going. Well, okay, I think we can start now, and hopefully as people come in, they'll catch up with where we're at. I'm gonna go over some housekeeping and cover a few things first before we get to our special guest tonight. So welcome to our fourth virtual author program in the Jean and John Rowe program series, part of our major initiative this year, My America, Immigrant and Refugee Writers Today. The initiative, of course, includes the multimedia exhibit we opened late last year, a programming and educational work that supports the initiative, the accompanying website now, myamerica.org. If you hadn't had a chance to visit the site, we of course encourage you to take a look at it after this program. We'll be posting a link in a little while to the site, my-america.org. We'll also post in the chat area a link to our YouTube channel, which houses some of our past programs, the programs that we're doing currently, and all the programs that we're going to be putting out over the next few weeks as we continue to work remotely. It's our expectation that even when we reopen, hopefully this summer, we will still be doing our programming online for a good long while. We don't want to be crowding people into this room. So a couple of other housekeeping things. As you're watching this conversation, if you have a question, please hit the Q&A button at the bottom and submit your question. We'll be monitoring that. Someone will reach out to you and let you know about asking your question out loud to the author a little bit later after we've asked a few upfront questions. If you like our online programs, if you like what you've seen in the museum, please think about becoming a member if you're not already one. Our book selling partner, as always, when we're here or online, is Seminary Co-op Bookstore. You can order and pre-order online from them or from bookshop.org as well. And there will be a link in the chat area to Laila's book for pre-order from Seminary Co-op. So tonight, I'm excited that I have a chance to interview a writer of great prominence, who is also one of the 30 featured writers in our exhibit, Dr. Laila Lalami. Dr. Lalami is currently a professor of creative writing at the University of California at Riverside and holds a PhD in linguistics from USC. She's also well known for her essays and opinion pieces that have appeared in newspapers from the Los Angeles Times to the New York Times, or in publications from The Nation to Harper's. On top of all that, she's written 4 novels, Dangerous Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, Secret Sons, The Moor's Account, which won the American Book Award, the Arab American Book Award, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, as well as being a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And most recently, The Other Americans, which was one of Time Magazine's most important books of 2019 and was shortlisted for the National Book Award, and was just released in paperback if you're looking for something to read while you're trapped in quarantine. Her upcoming book is a work of nonfiction entitled Conditional Citizens, which releases in September. Having had a chance to read it in advance, I encourage everyone watching to pre-order a copy tonight. It's a fascinating mix of memoir, journalism, historical analysis, and cultural criticism all rolled up into one. It's a book that really explores the notion of what it means to be a citizen in the United States and how greatly that varies depending on issues of race, class, gender, and more. So with that being said, Laila, I want to welcome you in spirit to the American Writers Museum, and thank you for joining us online tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think I'd just like to start with the idea of asking you about what it means by what you mean by the notion of conditional citizen, and when you started to recognize this notion that the nature of citizenship varies for people depending on their circumstances, you know, whether it's by race or faith or gender or class.
I would say that there's two ways in which that sort of experience sort of coalesced for me. One is just sort of a theoretical way, which is just by reading long before I even set foot in the United States, I had read about its history and its culture. And so I was well aware of some, aspects of its history that made citizenship sort of a tiered system whose benefits are available to a certain class of individuals and not to others. But the second part of it is a more direct experience for me that came out of just observing or experiencing how Americans are treated in the public sphere over the last 20 years. So the best example I can give that is relevant to this moment that we're in is, so I live in California, and and so we're all under stay-at-home orders, and the idea is that we're all staying home to keep everyone else safe. And so our governor has imposed these public health orders on everyone. And then this past weekend, he closed the beaches in Orange County because people were not social distancing when the beaches had reopened. And as a result of that, there were protests. And those protests then moved to Sacramento, which is the capital. And I don't know if you saw videos of this, but you had like these masses of people not social distancing, not staying the 6 feet apart, and not wearing masks, and crowding on the steps of the Capitol and coming right up to the cops and yelling in their faces and pushing and shoving. And under normal circumstances, that would fall under free speech, but we are in a pandemic. And any kind of physical presence next to somebody else endangers their lives and endangers the lives of these cops as well. And the reactions of those cops was to just basically stand there and put up with all of this. And you have to imagine what would have happened if these crowds, which are mostly white, had actually been mostly black or mostly brown people, how the cops might have reacted. And that comes to the idea of who gets to enjoy not just the full rights of citizenships, but a lot of privileges therein. And so that would be one way in which you could sort of explain this concept of conditional citizenship. Now, I'm an immigrant, and the book begins with my becoming a citizen in the year 2000. And so over the last 20 years, I've had a number of occasions in which I've observed this dynamic. Yeah. And in the book, I talk about examples like the one I just mentioned, which is sort of a public example that any of us can observe. And then I talk about sort of more private ones that I've experienced.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way you interface your personal experience with these larger topics. It feels like a memoir at certain points, and then you bring it into this larger context. Along with that, in the book, you talk about yourself being gray and living within gray spaces. You write at one point, every time the gray zone recedes, tribalism and sectarianism gain ground. Can you talk about what you mean by the gray?
So the idea for that actually came from a few years ago when the group known as ISIS had staged a terrorist attack in Paris. Yeah. And in preparation for that, they had put out a document. People might be surprised to know that ISIS has a PR department. And one of the things that they do is put out this magazine. And in the magazine, they were talking about their views of the world. And they divide the world into two camps. Their camp, which is the camp of ISIS, and then the camp of everyone else who is on the side of people like George W. Bush and so on and so forth, the camp of the Crusaders. And then the people who do not belong to either of these camps are called the grayish or the grayish hypocrites. And if you pause for one moment and think about what that view of the world means, it's a very tribalistic views of the world in which everything is either black or white. You're either with us or you're against us, as George W. Bush so famously said, and as they were saying as well. And the argument that I'm making is that most of us actually are in that gray zone where we don't want to take sides. We don't see the world in these in colors that are black and white. And in terms of citizenship itself, in a way, anybody who is in the gray zone of citizenship then becomes subject to having their rights questioned or to having their liberties questioned. So if you're an immigrant, for example, the way that this happens is you're expected to sort of perform a certain gratitude toward the United States for being the country that welcomed you and that gave you a home and gave you a number of opportunities. And any sort of refusal to abide by that sort of philosophy or any criticism of that is then interpreted as ingratitude and is interpreted as a betrayal. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the gray, is that if you are in a gray zone, then even your rights can become subject to debate. I hope I've explained that correctly.
No, I think that's great. I mean, and as I said, it's a very interesting component of the book, the way that you explore these areas, both in relationship to what's going on today, things that have happened in the past, and then, like I said, your personal experience. This idea that your personal experience kind of wraps each of the chapters in each of the areas that you're looking at. So each one kind of takes one personal memory and kind of uses it as a wrap, whether it's about faith or assimilation. So I'm kind of curious, in the writing of this book, as you were combining your personal experience with these larger topics and doing obviously a lot of research and analysis, were you finding that you were picking these personal memories based on the research that you did, or were you picking them, or were you doing the research based on your personal experience?
The second. So basically what would often happen is I would have an experience. So for example, being on Interstate 10 in West Texas and being stopped by Border Patrol and being asked, are you a citizen? Many people are surprised to hear that there are border checkpoints scattered across the United States that are within the borders of the United States and where you get asked about your citizenship. Now, most of us don't carry proof of citizenship with us, right? Unless you have a birth certificate or a passport with you. You have no way of proving that you are a US citizen. And so there's a lot of discretionary power that is given to Border Patrol officers. So that happened to me, and I got stopped and I was asked, and then I was let go. But then I started thinking, well, why do we have these checkpoints, and where did they come from, and how long have they been around, and what happens at them, and how are the towns where they're located affected by them? And that gave rise to a whole essay kind of exploring the notion of borders within the United States, and then comparing that with how I experienced borders in my own native country, so in Morocco, and like how borders, even in Morocco, kind of what border walls were built. So it starts first with the experience, and then it kind of leads to this reflection, and that leads me to research and to analysis, leading to the essay. Yeah.
And you were talking about the borders a little bit there, and you talk about it obviously in depth in that chapter. And I'm kind of curious, you talk about how both in Morocco and in the United States, we've moved from this idea of borders that were more porous or were very theoretical in construct to being obviously very physical. You talk about a city in northern Morocco that went from being something you just drove into that was part of Spain, right? And that suddenly has walls and a moat, the same way that we seem to be approaching our southern border. Right. I'm curious, when you look at it in the context of today with the global pandemic, how do you think that this nature of people looking at borders differently now than maybe they did 20 years ago affects how we look at issues like this pandemic?
Well, I think it's a question of how much are people paying attention to what happens at the border. One of the things that I explain in the essay is that And for some reason, a number of people are surprised to hear that the first border wall was constructed under the Clinton administration, and then it was expanded by the George W. Bush administration, and then by the Barack Obama administration, and then the Trump administration. So the Trump and border wall sort of rhetoric, all of that belongs in a long line. It's just that with the president's very vulgar way of speaking,
Yeah.
it really brings to the forefront these ideas about who we are and what we are trying to separate from the others, quote unquote. With the pandemic, what's been interesting is that the flow of migration has stopped. Now, people have always migrated, always throughout human history. People move because they are looking for opportunity, or they are looking for safety, or they're trying to reunite with family members. So there's push and pull factors, and it works the same way in every country, under every climate, and under every political system. Now, with the pandemic, it has forced everyone to stay in place, and that is true also of migrants. They are staying in place or returning home. So I don't know if you heard about this, but like in India, they had something like many millions of migrant workers being forced to move back home, and that was one of the largest migratory movements that India has had in the last half century. So it's kind of interesting in terms of like thinking through the border and why we bother having it, right? Because nobody's coming here. There's a pandemic. That's because the reason to move anywhere has stopped. Everybody's afraid and is sheltering in place in their home countries. And so instead, what you see is the appearance of virtual walls, where you have things like not processing visa applications, not basically curtailing the number of categories under which somebody can obtain a green card, things like that. So there's definitely a rise in like the erection of virtual walls. And then I think once we go back to normal, whatever normal looks like, I think that that's actually going to be expanded, where we're going to move away from focusing so much on physical barriers and basically move into a whole system of virtual barriers. And I think this administration is very much eager to do that, as is evidenced by their changes to immigration laws, or their attempted changes to immigration laws already.
Right. I'm you have a background in linguistics, obviously. I'm kind of curious, when you look at this book, do you feel like that played a part in what you were analyzing? I mean, do you take that as a way of looking at things? Because obviously there's this notion of what people think of when they say the word citizen versus what the truth is behind the word.
Yeah.
So how does that play into what you do?
Absolutely, it plays a lot. I think that, and you'll notice that a number of these essays begin on reflecting about how something was said, or unpacking what a particular word means, and definitely the word citizen. It's one of those words that, again, is used to mean very different things, and definitely deserves to be unpacked as it does in this book. So you'll hear sometimes people saying, I have a citizen, I'm a citizen, I have rights, right? Mm-hmm. So citizenship is basically the right to have rights. And when you then think about how we talk about it, like who gets to be American, or who can call themselves American, and who must hyphenate their Americanness, right? So say, for example, you're African American or Native American, but who gets to just be American tout court? There's all sorts of things like that around the notion of Americanness that I was interested in unpacking in this book. So,
okay. Yeah, I was kind of curious about the connection between your last novel, The Other Americans, and this book. I interviewed you last September about the book, and obviously there's an overlap here. You were looking at 9 characters or 9 voices in this very complicated novel, and all of them coming from the notion of citizenship and their belonging in this country from different perspectives. So Was that a driving force in getting you to write this book? Was this something you wanted to write for a while? What was the force behind it?
No, it's something that I've been working on the side for many years. And it just, what happened was once I was done with the novel, I had a bit of time on my hands and I just basically put this book together. The two projects don't actually, in my mind, are not connected, but that's because consciously I'm not trying to draw a connection between the two. With The Other Americans, which is out in paperback now.
Yep.
This one is, to me, a novel about our notion of America as told through 9 different voices. So it's a book about family and it's a book about community. But this one is, I would say, this is a critique and a memoir. So they're very different. So in writing a novel, it's more of an approach of trying to embody particular voices without judging them. Whereas in the nonfiction book, it's more a work of memoir and cultural criticism than it is anything else. I didn't set out to connect them in any way, but I think in some sense they reflect long-standing interests that I've had, I'm sure. And with this one, I definitely have been thinking about citizenship for many, many years and wrote bits and pieces of the book over the last 10 years. And so now I just kind of put it together in the last couple of years.
Okay. I want to open it up to questions in a second, so I'm going to encourage people, if they haven't submitted their question, to do so. So I'll ask just kind of one more. And that is, at near a certain point in the book, you have a chapter pulling from Frederick Douglass, "Do not despair of this country," from his famous speech on the July 4th, and the meaning of the July 4th for the Negro. And you say at one point in that chapter, "Despair is never without consequence. It is a gift of the status quo," which I think is a great line. And I'm kind of curious, when you are thinking about that, this is obviously a point at which you're trying, I think, as happens in The Other Americans, where you give us some sense of hope on something that feels very hopeless at points. So can you talk a little bit about, why Douglass for that, and also, what your notions are about how people can avoid the despair component, or why they should avoid the despair component?
I mean, I think it makes sense. I think it's interesting to me that the more hopeful book is the fiction, it's the novel. But in terms of this book and that particular last chapter, one of the things that I try to remember, particularly when we go through moments of great national despair, like right now would be one such moment. We are all stuck at home, and no matter how much you love your family and you enjoy being with them, it would be oh so nice to be able to, go out and I don't know, get a haircut or go to a restaurant or whatever. So it really feels there is such a great deal of uncertainty right now. And there is such a lack of national leadership. In fact, it's disastrous, really, that it's very easy to feel, just despair, things are never going to get better. And, what is going to happen to the workers who are out of jobs? What is going to happen to our civil rights if we get used to the idea that we never go anywhere? What is going to happen to our voting? Are we going to be able to vote safely? Are votes going to be counted or not counted? There's a great deal of anxiety, and some of that has to do with the nation itself and its future. And one of the things that I have always found inspiring is that when I read writers like James Baldwin, I feel that those people persevered through some of the worst times that this country has gone through, and yet they continued working and they continued advocating for what they felt was right. And Frederick Douglass, the reason that he comes up in that last essay is because that line is taken from his famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." And when I think that he wrote this and still said not to despair, then I feel like, what right do I have to despair if people went through something as ugly as what he had gone through and came out saying, do not despair. So for me, it's kind of inspiring, and also it's a reason to get up in the morning. I mean, if we give up, what is the point? What is the point of even getting up in the morning? You have to have that hope. You have to have the belief that through action and through work, that things can get better. That if you just give up and don't do anything, that things will surely get worse, but through action, things might get better, and a little bit better for the next generation.
I think that's a great bit, and part of the reason I was so enamored when I got to that point in the book was we were in the middle of creating a online exhibit based on our past exhibit on Frederick Douglass. So we've been going through the material we had on that exhibit, and it was just funny to me that, oh, this book connects directly to it.
That's funny.
So I'm going to ask our esteemed colleague Nikki to go ahead and open the Q&A up. I think we have Sahar would like to ask a question. So I'm going to see if I'm supposed to do something here. Hang on one second. Sahar, if you want to ask your question. I'm waiting, sorry. There we go, Sahar. Let me unmute you, or maybe you're unmuted. Sahar, I think you can talk now.
Hi, Laila?
Yes.
Hi, this is actually Sahad Mustafa. It's so great chatting with you. Congratulations on this essay collection. You know, I think you probably answered the question. It was basically, what was the relationship between the other Americans in this collection? I was wondering if one had started to shape the other. But I think you probably already addressed that. I'll ask this, which was more challenging to write? So, and obviously, you know, you are a journalist, you know, you've written essays. So I'm curious about maybe process-wise.
Yeah, it's very flattering that I think I'm a journalist. I think of myself more as a writer and commentator, but in terms of the books shaping the other, that's an interesting question because, let's see, I started working on The Other Americans in 2014, and I turned in my last edits, I think, in the fall of 2018. And then immediately switched gears and began putting this book together. I would say that one shaped the other to the extent that everything that I write or think about goes into shaping what it is that I work on next, and I bring what I learned from one book to the other. So in that sort of more of a sort of a natural way, then yes, it's possible to say that one shaped the other. And it's also possible that that's kind of what got me thinking about this notion of citizenship. Although in terms of the inspiration of the book, what really gave me the idea to start working on it in earnest was during the Democratic National Convention in 2016, when this gentleman, Khizr Khan, stood up on stage. It was a very dramatic moment, and pulled out that copy of the Constitution and said, "Have you read it?" And it got me thinking about how someone whose son had made the ultimate sacrifice for his country, you know, his son had died in Iraq and was immediately smeared as a jihadist and terrorist, and I mean, it was insane. And so I began to think about who gets to be American, you know? So the Captain Humayun Khan had taken on the uniform of the United States Army, had deployed to Iraq in a war that did not need to be fought. His parents show up at the convention, and then they all get smeared as terrorists. And that kind of just got it got me thinking about what it takes to really be called American without ever having anybody impugn your character in that way. And it's very clear to me that in their case, this was connected to their race and their religion. And so that really was what started this book, I think. If I had to point to a particular incident that got the book started. As far as process and how they are different, to me, they're very, very different processes. In writing fiction, it really is a matter for me of particularly exploring voice and character, and kind of just following it wherever it goes, and trying as much as possible to withhold judgment and exercise imaginative empathy. But in writing nonfiction, particularly a book of this nature, it is a book in which I allow my own feelings to kind of overtake the narrative, my own analysis to overtake the narrative, and my own anger to show in the narrative in a way that in writing a novel, I don't necessarily do. So I would say they're very different processes. And also writing a novel is a lot more labored for me. It's a project of several years. There's a lot of like world building and creation that goes into it. In writing nonfiction, my material is the world around me. And so it requires less world building, less of all of that. It requires more of an analysis. So it's generating pages is a faster process for me in writing nonfiction than it is in fiction.
I'm just curious, when you talked about the process in depth, I'm kind of curious about the publishing and editing process difference between fiction and nonfiction. How did that go for you, and how was it different?
Well, so my editor is Aaron McDonald at Pantheon, and he's an interesting fellow. So the way that he edited The Other Americans, I always tell this story because it's so amusing. When I turned in the first draft to him, or it was actually the third draft. But anyway, when I turned in my manuscript to him, he said, "Oh, congratulations, this is very good. We're very proud to publish it. And, I have just a few comments, it's just small stuff." And then there was a question, and it was, have you considered the other characters that you've created? Have you considered also letting them have a voice, not just the 2 or 3 that you've chosen? And it was like, what? It was such an architectural question, right? It was the entire book was being put into question. And I think the reason that it's amusing is that he basically said, "Oh, it's entirely up to you." And so the funny thing is that even when I turned in the manuscript to him, I knew that there was something that wasn't quite working, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And so when he asked that question, it was kind of like a light bulb moment for me. And so I said, okay. And then I went away, and I went away for another 2.5 years. And then I rewrote the whole book and had a lot more voices. So his comments tend to be more about like architecture and sort of the larger structure. In terms of this one, the nonfiction, one of the things I like about working with him is the feeling of complete freedom I have in shaping a narrative. Like I do feel very free to write.
Yeah.
And so, nothing was changed, or nothing was like, oh, no, it wasn't like that. It was mostly questions about, like, again, architecture, like ordering of the chapters, what should come first, and so on and so forth. It's not like he's not, or at least my working relationship with him is not one in which it's not one in which we go through page by page and have long debates. It's not like that at all. It's more about like the sort of entire shape of the book and how it's put together.
Yeah. Well, I figured it was pretty interesting and very different. I have a question from Allison. She asked me to read this. When you write, do you feel you are writing for a particular audience or community? And what do you feel is your responsibility to that community?
Well, I try as much as possible not to think about that. And the reason that I try not to think about a particular audience is I fear very, very much that thinking about a particular audience can force me into wanting to please an audience. And I think that that's very dangerous artistically, because art is a place where we explore and not necessarily, at least for me, not a place where we seek approval. And so thinking about an audience and getting those voices in my head, what are people going to think about this, to me is kind of a dangerous path. So I try to think of myself as a reader and what makes sense to me as a reader when I write. So I would say, I think maybe about the ideal reader being kind of a reader who enjoys books or enjoys the kinds of books that I read, but I don't think of an audience or a specific reader at all in writing.
Okay. I want to remind people, if they want to submit a Q&A, to do it in the Q&A component down below. And I think Ellen Deeb had something she wanted to mention to you, so I'm going to hand it over to Ellen. Hang on.
There we go.
Ellen, we can hear
Yes.
you now.
Okay. I don't actually have a specific question, but I did want to let Dr. Lalami know that I loved The Other Americans. I absolutely loved it. Last year I shared it with so many folks, and their feedback was extremely positive too, including I'm in several book clubs, one in Virginia with teachers with whom I used to teach, who are all retired, and then a book club I'm in down here in Orlando, Florida. I just wanted to mention my late husband was Palestinian, and although he had lived in the U.S. for 32 years and was a citizen, excuse me, he encountered some pretty terrible episodes after September 11th.
Right.
On one occasion, he was coming out of our local 7-Eleven. A man confronted him and shouted at him, "Go back where you came from." And I just wanted to mention that as an illustration of how the question of who is an American has left its impact.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for that comment. It certainly is something that I've heard from many different people when this idea of conditional citizenship comes about. And I always find it so troubling when you hear "go back to your country." It certainly is something that I have been told more than once. And it's so fascinating to me who gets to be the recipient of "go back to your country," right? And it's never people who enjoy, as I say, the full rights of citizenship. So nobody would say "go back to your country" to a wealthy, white, straight male, who basically the person for whom the concept of citizen was introduced in the United States. But it's often the people who are on the margins of that, the people who are in those gray zones. Thinking about this, I remember this picture that was making the rounds online this week, where at one of those reopen the economy protests, there was a man who was wearing a "Love It or Leave It" t-shirt, and he's holding a Confederate flag. And it's like,
Love it or leave it, holding the flag of the people who left it.
So it's never said like in a kind of like, it's not logical, it's very emotional, I think, and it goes to these notions of some people feel entitled to that, to being able to judge who's a citizen and who's not. And when people feel that way, they're the people who say go back where you came from and go back to your country. And don't forget that this is something that was said to members of Congress. You know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib were all told to go back where they came from. And you just have to wonder, you know, how come, I don't know, Gavin Newsom, our governor here in California, doesn't hear things like that. I mean, there's a reason, right? Like, we all know what that reason is. So this is really the point of this book, is to explore the boundaries of Americanness and how those boundaries are enforced. And by saying "love it or leave it," you're in a sense saying, you can be an American if you are quiet and you agree with everything that the government is doing. If you're a person of color, that's sort of the space that you can occupy. And so that's how it's enforced, by saying love it or leave it.
I think we have a question from Leah. Leah, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. I really love your books. I wanted to know if you had any advice for people who were looking to start writing non-memoir, creative nonfiction. I feel like your answer is just going to be to just do it, but I thought I would ask if you had any other advice beyond that. Thank you.
So you mean non-memoir creative nonfiction?
Yes, correct.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I think because so much of when people start talking about creative nonfiction, so much of the conversation is taken over by memoir and obviously it's not the only genre that exists in creative nonfiction. There are many different ways of writing creative nonfiction. As far as advice, I mean, right? I mean, you have the answer is in your own question, right? Like, you have to do it, right? The advice I would have would be to really consider what it is that's stopping you from doing the particular kind of creative nonfiction that you want to do. It's a very malleable form, right? You can do a lot in creative nonfiction. And I would say consider and explore what it is that's stopping you from actually doing it. Is it a question of, is it a pragmatic question? Like, is it a question of schedule or, not having time or having a full-time job or whatever? Then with that one, the answer that I would say would be to establish a routine, right? It's every day, pick an hour, even if it's early in the morning or late at night or at lunch or whatever is convenient with your schedule, but very religiously for that hour or 2 or 3, just stare at the blank page and see what comes and just do it over and over. Writers are people who write. And so you have to actually get into the habit of writing. It is a habit.
Thank you. And do you have any suggestions of other writers that you like that do that kind of writing?
That I'm doing?
Yes.
That's a good question, because in this book, it's a mix of memoir and criticism. I'm like looking, I have some non-fiction books here. Well, there's a number of people who are doing that. Like, the one that comes off the top of my head right now is Ben Ehrenreich, who has a new book actually coming out called Desert Notebooks, coming out in July. And that one, the focus is on climate change, but he does use a lot of his own personal experiences in framing that. Let's see. I would say also Valeria Luiselli has done some of this kind of work that mixes a bit of memoir and criticism. So she has a book called Tell Me How It Ends that is also like that. But if the thing that is stopping you is not schedule and is not time, but is more of like a block, like that's internal, that you don't quite know whether there's an audience for this or whether you're not sure about your writing, that I think is something that requires exactly what you suggested in your second question, which is to read, to look for people who are writing in the genre that you want to emulate. And if nobody is doing it or doing what it is that you want to do, then you have to be the first to do it. Just because it's not out there, you should be the one doing it.
That's great. I have another question. Maria asked me to read her question. I think she's nervous. So how does your teaching impact your writing, and vice versa?
That's a great question. A lot of people ask me this because they view teaching as being an impediment to writing. Because teaching takes time, you have to go to work, you have to teach, you have to grade, you have to serve on committees, you have to, there's a lot that goes on with these jobs. But I think rather than looking at it that way, one of the things I've learned over the years is to look at teaching as what it can teach me about writing. It's an opportunity essentially to articulate in front of my students what it is that I think about a particular piece of fiction or nonfiction. And in doing this and in getting in the habit of doing this, I find that I learn a lot about criticism and about reading. And the other thing too is that in reading student work, week after week, year after year, month after month, year after year, and marking it up. I've gotten into the habit of editing student work. And so that is a skill that I have brought into my own writing. So when I finish working on a particular manuscript, whether it's a story or an essay or the whole novel, I print the whole thing and then start over with a pencil or a pen and then edit the whole thing and then start over and then look at how I can rewrite. So it has taught me a lot. Teaching has taught me a great deal. It really has made me a student of writing, a lifelong student of writing, and that has been to my benefit. So I think there is a novel by John Coetzee called Disgrace, in which there is a line that goes something like this: "He who comes to teach learns the keenest of lessons." It was meant in a different context, but you see what I'm saying.
I think we have a couple more questions here. David Cowery. David, do you want to ask your question now? Go ahead, David.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to listen to you and finally meet you virtually. I've taught several of your books many times, and my students really love them.
Oh, so, thank you very much.
And you've written a lot about belonging and non-belonging, from Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, Secret Son, The Other Americans. And I was curious, what does it mean to you to be American, and what does it mean to you to be Moroccan?
That's a good question. I feel like it's a trick question. It's something that for me, I would say that identity formation has been something that I've been thinking about for the last, couple of decades. And you can see it in all of my work, as you've mentioned. So saying, how does it feel to be American, or how does it feel to be Moroccan? That's something that I consider Moroccanness and I consider Americanness almost all the time. What does it mean? Who gets to tell you whether you're in this group or in that group? Oftentimes, for example, being Moroccan and being highly visible on social media, what it means is that people get kind of used to hearing your voice, and they think that they know you. And so say, for example, my political views are well known, so there's no surprise there. But if I, for example, post something critical about the Moroccan government, then reliably there are a number of people who, well, it's not people, they could be bots or they could be government accounts that kind of all jump up at the same time to let me know exactly what they think. Or if it's something that's critical about society, sometimes there's pushback. So it's something that you see all the time. And the thing that's different about that is that then the idea of my being Moroccan becomes, well, what would you know? You've been living in the US for, more than 20 years. And so it's kind of the flip side of love it or leave it. Here, it's the opposite. If I'm critical of what's happening in the United States, then I get told, go back to your country. So for me, it's impossible not to consider questions of belonging and unbelonging, just because it is my lived experience. I see it every day. It's something that I experience, and therefore I think about a lot. And I think also because it has something to do with my being an immigrant, and when I see how immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, are treated, it's basically stuff that I think about constantly, and is part of the reason why I wrote this book. Because on the surface of it, my experience has been very positive. Like, I have nothing to complain about, right? I have made a life for myself in this country, and I am happily married, and everything is going well. But on the other hand, when I think about how some of this is the result of coincidence rather than anything that I've done, then it really makes me consider people who are less fortunate, for example, the undocumented, and want to write about that. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered your question, but.
So, David, thank you for that. I'm going to let Tatiana ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much. So my question is around the gratitude narrative of an immigrant. So it speaks a little bit to what you just said. But I was curious to know, as an immigrant, as a writer, how you believe that an immigrant has the right to free speech and how we're able to exercise that in a society that basically tells us that it's not a welcome narrative that you disagree or you go against some of the values that are portrayed through government and other communication.
Well, the United States Constitution says that you have the right to free speech, and you don't have to be a citizen to have that right. But what I think the reason that I talk about it in this book is that if you look at something, at particular immigrants that are in the public sphere. So if you look at somebody like, I don't know, Fareed Zakaria, I mentioned him in the book, and that's one of the reasons that I bring him up. He's an immigrant to this country, and he was a vocal proponent of the Iraq War. And so he was given ample room to advocate for something like that. Nobody said, go back to your country. Nobody said anything, because what the opinions that he was voicing were in line with those of the government at the time, and in line with sort of like military industrial complex. So that was fine. But then a couple of years ago, when the current president put together his Muslim ban, and Zakaria wrote that he was against it, then the calls of, well, if you don't like it, love it or leave it. So he did get pushback on that. So it's not a question, it's a question, yes, everybody is entitled to free speech, but if you are an immigrant, especially if you are an immigrant from certain countries, that the United States has a, shall we say, complicated, troubled, militaristic relationship with, then you are, in a sense, almost always watched for how you talk about certain things, and you're treated accordingly, right? So somebody like Ilhan Omar, who's a refugee from Somalia, when she speaks, everything that she says is scrutinized for any possible hint of sympathy with jihadists or anything that could be threatening. And so she even though she's a member of Congress, the range of what she can say without facing public outcry is not the same as what, say, for example, I don't know off the top of my head, Dan Crenshaw can say, right? So it's just, there are different levels of access to free speech if you are an immigrant. And so I think there is a certain implicit understanding that immigrants have of this rule, that you have to sort of perform your gratitude. And those who refuse that sort of dynamic and speak plainly and forcefully know what they can expect. They know that they are running the risk of getting that pushback and getting those kinds of answers.
That's great. There's a final question I think we have time for from Jay.
Thank you. In writing the nonfiction book, particularly in this internet age, when it gives a platform to any thought, no matter how few hold it, how do you separate broad community views, what people really think or most people think, from a few anecdotal statements or episodes?
No, I think that's an excellent point. I think that particularly in the age of social media, it's very easy for people to get whipped up in a rage over something without actually looking at how big or how small of a data point it is. So one example I can think of from just this last weekend is a picture went viral, supposedly, of the West Village in New York, where people were lounging in the sun, nobody's wearing masks, nobody's social distancing. And of course, it created very predictably a lot of outrage. And then you realize you don't actually know who took the picture. You don't know when the picture was taken. Is it really that that likely that that many people would have been out in the West Village this past weekend in the middle of a pandemic with not a single mask in sight. You know, it just seemed like it was one of those things that was designed to create outrage. And so I think that that's one problem, is to start considering like these little, you know, things that we see on social media, or even anecdotes. I'm trying to think of a good example, because that's something that can be weaponized, where you have like one single data point and it gets used to create a whole narrative. One of the things that I've tried to do in this book, and part of the reason why it's shaped the way it is to rely as far as possible. Like, so it starts with my experience, or it might start with something that I noticed or observed, but it tries to pull into actual data from social science. It's not, or from research or from experts. It's not based, the analysis, I hope, is not based at all on anecdotes, even if it is buttressed with them, you know, as a sort of as a way to provide illustration. But it's not the core of what I'm writing about. I'm trying to use as much as possible social science. I think that there is far too much reliance actually on anecdotes, and that can be extremely dangerous, particularly at a time of a pandemic where information is so valuable, and people do get confused because they hear all these different anecdotes rather than hard, solid data.
And that's a great answer, especially from a book that really combines the idea of your personal anecdote of your experience with such deep social science and such great critique. This has been a lot of fun. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day, which of course we all have time in our days now because we're trapped. But I want to thank everybody who was here. I'm going to mention that in the Q&A you can look, and we will again post the link to Seminary Co-op, specifically to the new book for pre-order. And of course, you can go to Seminary Co-op or bookshop.org or anywhere to order the paperback copy of The Other Americans, which is out right now. Laila, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this, and to our audience, thank you for being so involved tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Bye.